Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to give people a minute to join us, but I just want you to know that we're here and we're looking forward to this conversation. And now it's 1:30, so I'm going to join. I know that others are joining us as we start, but I want to give our panelists the full hour and a half that we have. So thank you all so much for joining our conversation about the manifestation of white supremacy in the child welfare system. This is just level 1, so hopefully all of you will join us again for level 2 on September 16th. Our panelists will be leading that conversation as well. So today we are having part 2 of our webinar series on interdisciplinary representation for parents. Many of you joined us back in May when we had our first webinar, and on that day we sort of sadly celebrated the day that we would have all been together in Denver, Colorado, thinking about how we can best support and strengthen families through the child welfare system, and especially through parent representation. So this is our second. We'll have our third in September, and we will continue this webinar series until we can meet again in person, and hopefully that will be really soon. As we did in the last webinar, we encourage you all to chat with each other, chat with us. Comments, thoughts, hooray for the panelists can go in the chat. We're also hoping, though, that you will use the Q&A to pose questions for our panelists. And at the end of this program, we're setting aside some time for the panelists to respond to your comments and questions. If your question is specific to a particular panelist, please just write their name in the question. But otherwise, Mr. Corey Best will be facilitating that section and sharing the questions with all of our panelists. If you have questions for me, feel free to chat them. I will be following the chat. And again, just thank you so much for joining what I know is going to be a really thought-provoking conversation. I've had the pleasure of sitting in on some of the prep calls with the panelists, and they have given all of this a lot of thought, a lot of heart, a lot of passion, and they are ready to share it with you. So right now, I would like to introduce our panelists, and they will be taking turns and sharing their thoughts with you. So in alphabetical order, we have Milena Arnaud, who is a social worker in the interdisciplinary model of parent defense at the Center for Family Representation. We have Corey Best, who is a consultant through Mining for Gold, and also a leader in the Birth Parent National Network. We have, oh, now I lost track of my alphabetizing, MJ Jihad, who's a consultant in Denver, Colorado. We have Renee Jones, who's a social worker at the Washington State Office of Public Defense, another example of interdisciplinary representation. And Balu Okazagi, who's also working in the Washington Office of Parental Defense. So right now, I'm going to turn it over to Corey, and I'm really looking forward to what all of you have to share. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Mimi, and I am looking forward to a healthy discussion with my colleagues and panelists today, and I welcome everybody. Good morning and/or afternoon, depending upon where you are. Before we begin, I really want us to be grounded in why we're here, and a part of that is to acknowledge the land that has been stolen through white supremacy. So I am calling in today from Florida, and I sit and reside and work on Timucua and Seminole land. So just allow that to sink in for just a moment, that we're all here and uphold white supremacy one way or another, and many of us have inherited benefits that we did not necessarily, nor did our families necessarily earn and work for. So I want to not ever forget those broken treaties as we go through our time today. The other piece of level setting here for me is to go over a few elements that we'll hope to accomplish today through a conversation. I will speak a little bit about the legacies of white supremacy and anti-Blackness, become more grounded in the dimensions of racism, interrogate several ways white supremacy manifests itself in child welfare. We'll have some time at the back end with our panelists and or myself to review some insights, reflections, and some deepened truths. As we dive deeper or free fall, I like to believe sometimes in this conversation, we'd like to be reminded that we do hope that you'll be able to adhere to our group agreements, choose authenticity over comfort, embrace the messiness and kindness, practice personal and group accountability, be aware of equity of voice as you're utilizing the chat, listen with the same passion with which you want to be heard, honor subjectivity versus objectivity. And before we go any further, I think it would be remiss of me if I did not recognize that we're 51 days away from George Floyd's brutal public lynching, 143 days away from Ahmaud Arbery's, 124 days away from Breonna Taylor's murder that has still not seen any form of accountability and or justice, and 75 days since young Cornelius Fredericks was murdered at the hands of his group home staff in Kalamazoo, Michigan. You know, that tells me a lot about our legacies, the legacies of white supremacy that continue to promote anti-Blackness and also churn out some racial disparities across all systems. James Baldwin teaches me that I cannot always prove that you hate me, but I don't see myself reflected in leadership roles. I can't always prove that the police truly dislike me, but I always see how I'm treated by them, and those that look like me are treated by them. In child welfare, it's similar. Young Black men, boys, girls, and the families don't always prove, because of the subjectivity of racism or white supremacy, can't always prove that the workforce dislikes them or intentionally treats them discriminatory. However, when you have a deeper conversation with many of the families, you can see that the legacies run deep in our child protection system. Patriarchy down to race evasion, which can also be considered colorblindness. The way that we choose to ask families to assimilate to a standard of whiteness, colonization, slavery, segregationist beliefs, meaning that there is something innately wrong with Black people, and also the theft of native land, which you know and I know is one of the most effective ways to transfer wealth to our families. So this concept of white supremacy, it doesn't always come from a place of European superiority. It comes from a place truly that has three levers or three tiers to them. One of which is anti-Black slaveability. The other, of course, is Orientalism, where all foreigners, and foreigners is code definitely for non-white people and those who are not Black, all foreigners or Orientalism could come together and adhere to a white supremacy system because at last, even though I am not white, it's better than being Black, because Black was always at the bottom of the ladder. And when you think about genocide as a pillar that uplifts, constructs, and upholds white supremacy, you think of the indigenous settler binary of where indigenous people were asked to give up their indigenous culture, heritage, and also to give up their land. And so that brings us to a deeper level set here before I set the stage for, as I set the stage for my colleagues. When I think about anti-Black racism, which is based on the idea that Black people were made to be slaves, and I'll dive a little bit deeper into that in just a moment. But I'm a firm believer that history has more to do with the present than it has to do with the past. And as we know, history creates our culture, how we believe, what we think about the world, the things that we uphold, the things that we justify, how we rationalize the treatment or the mistreatment of Black and brown families is all due to the history. That history creates our identity, an identity that some of us really hold on to. And it works sort of like a system. What we're trying to disrupt, deconstruct, are the power and economics that are actual drivers, because slavery and capitalism are conjoined twins. And the internal pieces of a system, the way you can look at this infinity circle is to think about your body itself. When your body is sick, has a cold, a virus, or what have you, it does certain things to get back into balance. Right now, after 51 days, the world is out of balance, and some systems would like to get back into balance. Today, we're going to walk through what racism is in 4 areas. We'll focus a lot on institutional, structural, interpersonal, and internalized. The internal pieces are where most individuals have a hard time moving from. And hopefully level 1 will get you beyond what you feel about Black and brown people, what you do to Black and brown people, how many Black and brown friends you have, and your husband and wives are also Black and brown. It matters, but it's the structure, it's the water, it's the soil that we till that gives us the opportunities to either disrupt or uphold white supremacy ideology. Racism at its core, from the People's Institute, teaches me that there's a formula. And I think this is something that I'll ask you all to think about as you listen and engage in a conversation with our panelists today, that race, prejudice, plus social and institutional power is the equivalent to racism. Racism is a system of ideology, belief system that is to uphold a white supremacy culture supported by and dependent upon all class collaboration called white to end racial labor solidarity. Racism is also a system of advantages based on race, and it's also a system of oppression based on race. And so there's a narrative in child welfare that we're up against. And I think before we get into anything about anti-racism, about equity, about diversity or inclusion or cultural competency, we, from our legal offices and our interdisciplinary teams, working with social workers, parents, in our constructs, we have to understand the myth of anti-Blackness and how this peculiar system of slavery is eerily similar to the system of child protection. And I'll ask you to listen closely as I read this, and then I'm going to turn it over to Milena to dive deeper into the institutional dimension of racism. The institution of slavery per se is as justifiable as the relation of husband and wife, parent and child, or any other civil institution of the state, and is most necessary to the well-being of the Negro, being the only form of government or pupillage which can raise him from barbarism or make him useful to himself or others. And I have no doubt but that institution thus far in this country has resulted in the happiness and the elevation of both races. That is, the Negro and the white man. In no period of the world's history have 3 million of the Negro race been so elevated in the scale of being, or so much civilized or Christianized as those in the United States as slaves. They are better clothed, better fed, better housed, and more cared for in sickness and in health than has ever fallen to the lot of any similar number of Negro race in any age or nation. And as a Christian people, I feel that it is the duty of the South to keep them in their present position at any cost and at every peril, even independently of the questions of interest and security. Let that sink in for just a moment, and then think about how similar that is to child protection. What we'll attempt to do before I turn it over to Milena is not become bogged down on examining the impact of racism on Black body, but instead take this opportunity that we have in the world, the State of the Union, to really recognize that it's time for a white examination. It's time for you, white people, white institutions, to truly understand not the symptoms of racism, but the causes of racism, and how we all play a role. Like Shakespeare said, the world's a stage and we all act. So we'll talk about the interconnectedness of our systems to perpetuate racial discrimination and disparities. Milena, with that, I wonder if you're able to tell me from your perspective, how is the child protection system similar to the institution of slavery?
Thank you, Corey. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I think Corey really set a foundation for what I want to touch on a little bit today. And in no way is this an exhaustive history of the child welfare system or the social work profession at all. But I think that it's important that we understand the history and that these are not coincidences that we are still dealing with this today and the parallels. I want you, as I'm giving some examples today, to keep in mind what Corey has talked about and to, for yourself, draw the connections to the institution of slavery and how we see it perpetuated in different ways in the child welfare system, in the social welfare system in general, and then as a social worker in the social work profession. So I want to start, there's so many places, and I think I would also challenge you that for the pieces of information that were left out today, that you go back and analyze them with the same lens that we're trying to incorporate today. So I will start with the Indian Civilization Act of 1819, taking it back. And I think that it's very important because I think it's one of the first times in a very documented way that we as a country created a very systematic way of taking children from homes with the explicit idea of changing them. And with the explicit understanding, and I think a lot of us would argue that that is something we see today, right, in the foster care system, but with the Indian boarding schools, the parallels that we can see of forced Americanization, forced whiteness, the forced normalization of whiteness, often through military force and violence. And so that, I think, if we think of that as a base, right, like the beginning of foster care, and then we transition, we jump 50 years to the orphan trains and the beginning of the Children's Aid Society, right? Many of us in New York deal with the Children's Aid Society. We work with them. And the creation of a system that allowed for close to 200,000 children to be forcibly often taken. These are not always children without families to care for them, but forcibly taken and shipped away, trained away, and given to other families. And in the literature on the orphan trains, I think it's really important to note that a huge portion of this had to do with teaching children from urban areas how to function, and the idea of how the narrative that we created around productivity and the relationship between productivity and whiteness and how non-whiteness was non-productive. I think it's really important in all these conversations to be thinking also about the narratives that were created throughout these times. And so then I'm going to jump. And I think we could talk about the orphan trains and the many, many problems with them for hours. But I want to jump to the 1912, the creation of the Children's Bureau. which is a very important moment in the child welfare system. It's the first federal movement to talk about children in a way, and a lot of that was based on labor considerations. But I think it's really important to say that we were not talking about well-being of children prior to 1912 in a federal, on a federal level. But many things were happening that resemble the things that we see today. So many of the actions, right? So the Indian boarding schools, the orphan trains, were all done prior to anyone signing off on it. So I want to name that to continue to point out the normalization of it. And then I want to just shift gears a little bit to talk about the social work profession and with the movement of the settlement houses. And I think we could get into talking about the English Poor Laws and how those movements created, set the stage for the settlement houses in the United States, and as particularly in urban areas. But I think that it's often, the settlement houses are often seen as the core base of the social work profession, right? So we start to see in the late 1800s, settlement houses popping up, right? 1898, we see the first accredited social work program in New York. So all of these things are developing together. I think it's really important that we can name very explicitly, as when we say they are developing together, we're talking about white women starting settlement houses and then using those platforms to create legislation and who those voices represented and in what way. So the settlement houses, I think, are really important to talk about because it also was, it was not only wealthy white women going in and literally living in communities that they were not a part of, but it was based on a morality. And I think it's really important that we can, the morality conversation is something that I think is something we have shifted away from talking about, but how those values continue and permeate, right, all the systems that we see today. And the idea of, in the settlement houses, of talking often, right, these older processes of understanding who the deserving poor and who the undeserving poor were. And the settlement houses with the idea that many, and especially in the urban areas, that many of the immigrant communities needed help, and that they needed help so they could achieve the American dream. And the whiteness of the American dream, I think, is not lost. And in no way we have not come across a lot of literature or documentation of the immigrant voice in those developments of what those settlement houses were going to provide, what types of extracurricular. There's a lot of praise of the settlement houses and what they gave back to the community, with no consideration of those of the voices of those impacted the most. And I think it's really important that we just lay out the settlement houses is often crowned as one of the greatest accomplishments of the social work profession, which is inherently a wealthy white women with wealthy white standards and wealthy white logic going into urban communities, and not always urban communities, though the majority of the settlement houses were, and helping through personal example poor people learn how to be more white. Or not necessarily, I would actually take back, not learn how to be more white, but assimilate to be more white in a way that was acceptable. I think it's very important to really understand the beginnings of the social profession. And in order to understand what we're seeing today and how we can even begin to dismantle that process, I think it's very important to understand the history. And I know I only have a few more minutes, but I want to talk also, want to jump back to child welfare policy. And in 1935, the Social Security Act and Aid to Dependent Children, which is one of the first places that we start to see a shift from child welfare from the early 1900s to a little bit more what we understand child welfare today, of looking at a more overall understanding of a child's well-being. And the standards that were used and then were transitioned in the 1960s, back in the 1930s and the 1960s, were this idea of suitability. And I name that because I think there's no way to talk about child welfare policies or the social work profession without understanding who created the standards by which we then assess everyone by. And the suitability standard actually was originally around if it was suitable for a child to live in a home without a man. So the suitability are these mothers unwed? We shifted in the 60s. One could argue we didn't shift very much, but that it was less about now, is there a man in the home, therefore is it suitable? And it was more about looking at a child and determining if the home was suitable. And we start to see first the distinction between the child and their home, and the child and their family, and them as independent. But we also start to see the money and how funding associated with the 1960s Fleming rule that took away the suitability in the way we understood it before. We start to see how that financial incentive is no longer about the family, but it is about what is suitable for the child, and that separation. And it's important to note that for the arguments of suitability became first the importance of the transfer of responsibility from a family to determine that, right, to an outside person determining that suitability. But also who became the experts of child rearing and homekeeping in that way? White women, right? Those same women who started, not the same women, but the same women who started the settlement house movement. And so we just start to see, my main takeaway that I would like for all you to take away from my portion is just how we determine these standards and how we see these standards come not very far, right, from when we're talking about Native children being removed from their home and forcibly taken to boarding schools, to then other children placed on orphan trains, to then children for children placed in the foster care system. So I will pose a question to our next panelist, Beilu, and I'll just ask, in what ways do we think that the child welfare system has learned from its past, or maybe hasn't?
Thank you, Marlena, or Melina. So I think this is actually kind of an interesting question, considering, where we are currently, and arguably one of the largest movements in U.S. history, right, in our organizing for Black lives. So I would say, yes, our system has definitely changed, but in terms of how we interact with Black and Brown families, or communities of color, it's more of the same, essentially. So I think the three things that I want to focus on is, like you were saying, we have a deeply problematic history around family separation in this country, particularly as it relates to Black and Brown and Indigenous, stuttering today apparently, Indigenous communities, and that racial disproportionality in foster care, and ICE family separation and detentions of children are a few contemporary examples of how this persists today. I also want to talk about sort of how these cumulative and compounding intersections between child welfare and other institutions converge on Black and Brown bodies, and the impacts that has. And then I also want to talk a little bit about our systems and how they rely heavily still on myths that are based in white supremacy and that perpetuate continued disproportionality in all of our systems, really. So a few years ago, I went to see Dr. Angela Davis speak in Reno, Nevada. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, she's a brilliant activist, an academic, and author. Much of her work focuses on the abolition of prisons and the prison industrial complex. One of the many things that she impressed upon me during those few hours was that prisons don't disappear problems, they disappear people. And that this practice of disappearing vast numbers of people from poor, marginalized, and immigrant communities is for profit. And I've been thinking a lot lately about this idea around disappearing people. And it's been central to a lot of the conversations that I've had with my family and friends and colleagues recently. And I imagine that it's, for many of you, one of the predominant reasons that you're here and engaging with us today. Our systems disappear Black and brown bodies, and we're just coming to this relative consensus that this is actually fact. So Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Rashad Brooks, Philando Castile, Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Charlene Lyles. It's a really, really long list. And whether they're disappeared through literal acts of state-sanctioned violence or institutional and systemic acts of violence like incarceration, family separation, detention, and deportation, the fact remains that large swaths of our communities have disappeared. Men, women, children, elders, community leaders, mentors, human beings, losses like these are catastrophic. They destroy families and communities. And there's overwhelming evidence to support the view of modern policing, how we see it today, and sort of where the prison industrial complex originated, was sort of invented in this maintaining of the social hierarchy that we sort of established around who has power in this country. And it serves much the same function really today. Black, brown, marginalized people have known policing to be violent and terrorizing and relentless since its inception. But up until recently, these experiences have been erased and dismissed. Our earliest examples of policing in this country are slave patrols and organized efforts in labor movements to suppress. At the end of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but it allowed, except for as punishment of a crime. And this opened up the door for so many more. This opened the door for us to sort of exploit this loophole for years to come. So we see similarities in how our prison system treats incarcerated folks, starting with sort of prison populations being leased by state governments to plantations and railroads. And we think about, and sort of thinking about the disproportionality in surveilling Black and brown communities, harsh sentencing, mandatory minimums. These are just a few ways that we've continued to feed the prison industrial complex's insatiable appetite for Black and brown bodies. Even though crime is down overall, sentencing and drug policies that target nonviolent crimes fuel the bulk of the growth in mass incarceration. But this has other consequences, and we're here to discuss some of these. So 80% of incarcerated women are mothers. And I should note that women are the fastest growing population of incarcerated folks in this country. They represent roughly roughly 1 in 18 Black women will experience incarceration. That's 1 in 45 Latinx women, and compared to only 1 in 111 white women. Fathers are also impacted by this as well. Mass incarceration has a really deeply destabilizing impact on Black and brown communities. So we see, or the child welfare system rather, serves about 700,000 youth every year, children and youth every year. Roughly 430,000 of those come into care, and nationally, children of color make up about 55% of those. So we know decisively that there's a marked overrepresentation in families of color in the child welfare system, and we know that children and youth are involved in the system really struggle. Children who age out of foster care are less likely to graduate high school or college. They experience more serious mental health problems, including PTSD. When compared to children generally, they're less likely to receive adequate health and mental health care, and are more likely to experience homelessness and be involved with the criminal justice system themselves. And even with this acknowledgement, we still continue to place out of home a lot. Children and families are affirmatively harmed by the child welfare system. Black and brown families are especially impacted because we consistently fail to address the structural causes that threaten child safety and family stability. Also, we really have no framework to counteract the way systems converge on Black and brown youth. Black and brown youth are more likely to be diagnosed with disruptive behavior disorders, ADHD. They're more likely to be perceived as combative and are less likely to receive access to appropriate interventions and treatments because of these biases. Black and brown youth, children and youth are misunderstood and criminalized every day in child welfare. And the problem is so severe that 1/4 of former foster kids will be involved in the criminal justice system within 2 years of leaving care. So currently, and this was shocking to me, 80% of prison inmates have spent some time in foster care. So unlike the criminal legal system, child welfare is often protected against appropriate critique because it's perceived as having a helping nature. And the fact is, child welfare is historically and currently punitive and awful. The reality is that both the criminal system and the foster care system are rooted in deeply violent historical narratives that promote punishment and do little to protect Black bodies. Broad-scale policies and societal shifts have imperiled large segments of Black and brown communities and fostered continued disproportionality and overrepresentation in many of our systems. And those involved in child welfare and criminal legal systems are stigmatized. And we, as a society, believe that this is rooted in bad family values and sort of this bad seed or assumed tendencies towards criminal predispositions. But the fact is, these systems and the way that they converge on our communities are hugely destabilizing and disrupting. And these ideologies promote and protect a specific investment, right? Which is the prison industrial complex or the foster care industrial complex. And the commodity are Black and brown men and women and children. So child welfare functions similarly to the prison industrial complex with funding structures that incentivize foster care interventions, encourage TPRs, and incentivize adoption. Foster care is an industry that very much needs other people's kids to survive. So we really have to start thinking about how these children and youth are being funneled into the system. They're not getting what they need. They're not getting access to the services and interventions that they need. They're not better for it. They suffer tremendously. Another shocking thing that I had read recently in preparing for this is that children who foster youth who age out of care are twice as likely to experience PTSD than war veterans. And so I think we really have to start asking ourselves, is the foster care system the best we can do? And I'll kick this to MJ on this note. So considering that our systems are founded in white supremacy, how are the best solutions that we've come up with rooted in white supremacy?
Thank you, Beilu. That is a wonderful question. I want to start off by saying welcome to everyone. My name is MJ. I give a couple of shout outs. I saw some people from Tulsa, Oklahoma. That's my hometown. And my second home is New Orleans, Louisiana, but I'm here in Colorado as well. So thank you to everyone for being here, my colleagues. The piece that I want to talk about mainly is the psychology piece. So the internalized white supremacy within the field of mental health and psychology. I'm currently in my last year for my PhD in international psychology through the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. Last year for PhD students, if any students are out there, is considered purgatory. So I want you to know that's where I'm at right now. What I found to be shocking and interesting, so right now there's this new wave of psychology that is cultural psychology, cultural competency psychology, international psychology. And essentially, it is the understanding that a lot of the basis of psychology is a white man's science. It's a white man's mental health science, correct? So with that, how are you able to use this psychology, which is originated in white American, Eurocentric, Western thoughts, and how are you able to use that within other cultures? I went to the American Psychological Association conference last year that was in Chicago last summer. And the entire conversation, which was absolutely incredible, had to do with race. So there's this huge shift that has been happening behind the scenes. Something that I did not know was that there has been a huge, very large misdiagnosis of schizophrenia in the Black community. And there's history of this. Again, I did not know this. I've been a student of psychology for many, many years, and I did not know this until I came to this conference way later in my educational field. And one reason why Black men specifically were misdiagnosed with schizophrenia is because during the civil rights movement, the white supremacy that our system is rooted in, that the United States is rooted in, wanted to be able to say, this is why it was better for Black people to be slaves. So they had made a comment and said, there's no way that Black people can be this happy or this jolly, or there's no way that Black people can suffer from depression. Therefore, it is schizophrenia. So that hit me really hard. So I really want that to sink in with you. I want that to sink in that there are generations of Black families that believe schizophrenia runs in their family. So you have to think about what that narrative is, what that narrative does to a family, a community, the psyche of a person. So that was back in the 1950s. So as I'm doing 1950s, 1960s, so as I'm doing more research about misdiagnosis, there are in the prison system, there's been many misdiagnoses of schizophrenia in the prison system with mainly Black men. Currently, we talk about the mental health and the misdiagnosis. So for Blacks, they are currently misdiagnosed 4 to 5 times more than their white counterparts. And for Latinx, they are misdiagnosed with schizophrenia 3 to 4 times, right? So we have the prison systems that are misdiagnosing. And then in the child welfare system, so to kind of bring it back to base, they continue to misdiagnose children in the foster care system. And those children, as we know, are disproportionately put into the system by being Black and brown. So for, I wanna make sure that I get the numbers right. So for Black children, due to the lack of cultural sensitivity, due to the lack of cultural competency, and also due to clinical stereotype and clinical biases, people in the psychology field, again, misrepresent and misinterpret the behaviors, the relationships with the community of people of color in their community. So an example of this would be if a Black person came into a clinician's office and made the comment, I speak to God, or God speaks to me, automatically that white clinician, not being culturally competent, will say, okay, well, obviously it's schizophrenia. Again, that misrepresentation, that misunderstanding puts an entire affliction, which is like a cancer, in the Black community, which again continues the narrative of all of these people, or this kind of people, are ... crazy, schizophrenic, mental health issues. In the foster care system as well, what they're not understanding is how depression shows in young white teens or young white youths looks very different than how it can kind of show up for young brown and black kids. So an example of depression for young white teens can be isolation, can be loneliness, quietness, where in black teens it's going to be aggressiveness, it's going to be irritable and so forth. So I just wanted to give you that history because it is so relevant as we are still, and I work on a multidisciplinary team as well. So I'm a social worker and I work with attorneys. I work in the guardian ad litem's office, but also with parent representation. And we are forcing our clients, usually our parents and our kids, to participate in all of these mental health assessments. I don't know a lot of treatment plans that I've ever had in almost a decade of doing this work where there's not on the treatment plan for my clients an assessment, a mental health assessment, a substance abuse assessment, all these assessments that again are not culturally sensitive, are not culturally competent. We do have to, it's so funny because this topic is so important and I really can't wait for us to have part 2 about what those solutions look like, but I am running out of time. What I want to leave you with is, again, with that mental health piece and the psychological damage that does to a society and how it upholds white supremacy, how white psychology upholds white supremacy, as well as help fertilize the anti-Blackness that people of color experience. An example of that would be, I always I make the joke that Black people are truly afraid that Black lives will only matter for about another 6 weeks or so, because the equivalent that I say that Black America's relationship is with white America is equivalent to a domestic violence relationship. So in domestic violence, you have the abuser and or perpetrator who we would identify as white America. How do they continue to gain and control, to continue to have power and control over the victim / and or survivor, which would be Black Americans? So the multiple components of domestic violence is the physical violence. So we're talking about the broken ribs, the rapes, the multiple assaults, the spitting in the face, the killings, and this is how we see it played out. In the mental piece, we're looking at the idea of what they deserve, right? This is what the perpetrator will say. This is what they deserve. Look what you made me do to you. The insults, racial slurs, and so forth. And as we know what that is, the gaslighting portion, which is, it's all in your head, it doesn't exist, right? Another huge component that we think about in a domestic violence relationship is to keep that power and control, you have to gain that money and finances, right? So again, living in Black America, what does that money and finance relationship look like? So the less job opportunities dependent on the perpetrator to continue to fund you because you feel as though that's what you need to live and so forth. So I say that to say that where we are now is in just one of our many cycles of domestic violence, which is we have a place in time where the survivor will say enough is enough, and then they leave, or then they fight back, or they do something. But then as we know, it takes about 7 times for the survivor to actually leave that relationship. So right now, as Black America, we're trying to figure out, where are we in this cycle? Where are we in this cycle? We continue to get gaslighted. We continue to get manipulated. We continue to question ourselves of, do we really deserve this? And I think that's one of the hardest parts, is to figure out, where are you, white America, in this cycle of domestic violence? Usually the domestic violence aggressor will come back and say, no, okay, I didn't mean to do this, or it was only this one time. They will acknowledge the easy things, which is, well, that one time I hit you in your face, but that was, kind of by accident. You were in the way, you knew I was angry. Rarely at the very beginning does the perpetrator actually talk about, this is why I treat you the way that I treat you, and this is what's wrong with me to do that. So as you are analyzing where you are within your cycle of being either the perpetrator or the survivor of domestic violence, I want you to keep in mind another thing. And this goes into the anti-Blackness as well. I think that it is very strong and very powerful to have the murders of young Black and brown children or young Black and brown men and women on television. But the narrative that also teaches is, one, this is what's happening. And the second narrative that we have to think about with especially young Black boys. Young Black boys, they're doing a lot of research study of how does seeing those murders on TV consistently, because it happens all the time, how does that, one, educate, and then how does that, how do you internalize that anti-Blackness? So when a young Black boy sees someone that looks like them murdered on TV, how does that internalize with them as far as their anti-Blackness relationship and their relationship with white America? Because what it can look like is, again, you deserving that punishment, that we are meant to be exactly where we are right now. So I'm very, very grateful to have this conversation. We can continue to have each one of my colleagues, we can have this conversation for absolutely hours, days, and webinars and so forth. But I do want to go ahead and move it to one of my wonderful colleagues, Ms. Renee. The question that I have for you is, how has the internalized sense of superiority and weaponizing white womanhood impacted the child welfare system? And I want to repeat myself because, Renee, I know you're going to unpack a lot, but for the viewers to hear, how has the internalized sense of superiority in weaponizing white womanhood impacted the child welfare system? Thank you.
Thank you so much, MJ. Hey, first of all, I want to bring it back to this idea of domestic violence, that I want to just take one other step on that, and this idea of all these symbolic things that all these corporations are doing and putting out as kind of this way to scramble, right, as the survivor is attempting to leave, right? It's this attempt to reconcile in these very symbolic but not actually substantive ways. And so I just wanted to speak to that one little piece because that really spoke to me, MJ. Also, so one of the things I really wanted to, in answering your question, MJ, is I think it's important to talk about cognitive dissonance that happens to white people in relation to white supremacy. Cognitive dissonance means that we believe one thing, but our actions show something different. And a prime example of this would be Amy Cooper's. So from all that I've ascertained at this point, Amy identified as liberal, as left-leaning. She donated to the Democratic campaigns and voted for Obama. So why is it when faced with this conflict, she used her whiteness as a weapon? She called upon this legacy of policing, knowing that her actions would result in violence towards Black bodies. And for those of us white women who end up in helping professions like child welfare and dependency, do we need to be looking deeper into our own beliefs and actions at the risk of destroying Black and brown families? So white supremacy, the term, becomes something that us well-meaning white people can say that we are against, but actually continue to have a role in upholding. On the other hand, the word racist becomes this individual personal attack for most of us. We get defensive, we shut down, we say, nope, not me, I'm not Karen. I post liberal things, I support progressive politics, I vote for policies and leaderships that reflect that I'm not racist. We point fingers at others. We do anything we can do to separate ourselves from being labeled racist. And we get away from the uncomfortable feeling of being called out or being wrong or feeling shamed. So much so that we take that uncomfortable feeling and we weaponize our whiteness against Black and brown communities. And while I know a lot of us associate white supremacy and racism as being a bad person with overt testosterone-fueled expression by white men, right? Like that's kind of some of the narrative that has happened. We're also failing to acknowledge the very real and often primary role that white women have had, both historically and current day, and weaponizing our whiteness against Black and brown people. And so when I'm talking about weaponizing white womanhood, I'm talking about how us as white women have historically taken our identities as women and intentionally or unintentionally leveraged our identities at the cost of Black and brown communities. For us white women socialized in white supremacist systems, our comfort becomes more important than the safety of Black people. And I want to repeat that because it's something that is so important, that for us white women, our comfort becomes more important than the safety of Black people. So historically, white women were viewed as pure or fragile and victims in need of protection or defending. Our roles and value were in caretaking, but we simultaneously held power while still being objects to violate and protect. And so there was this constant struggle to find power wherever that was. And the insidious narrative became that displays of violence against Black people was viewed as this like valor or chivalry. And this narrative has been so ingrained into how we function as a society that what we say and do as white women is still taken from this historic context. We don't talk enough about how much white women have been at the center of white violence. You know, some examples, the Tulsa Race Massacre, right? That started because of a white woman alleging that a Black man assaulted her in an elevator. And it resulted in this massive destruction in the name of white women. Emmett Till is another example, accused of whistling at a white woman and resulted in his torture and execution. In fact, if anybody gets a chance to check out the lynching memorial in Alabama, you can see the monument to the Black people who were killed. And the vast majority of them were killed due to accusations from white women or in the name of white women. Women also started their own branch of the KKK, which gave racism a softer side, and it appealed to more moderate white women. White women opened food banks and community kitchens for white people. Women also saw schools as an extension of their home and had a large role in shaping school curriculum to whitewash history and other topics. And then many people may know that the White Women's KKK was also a large component of the suffrage movement. And which white women used to elevate their own voices at the expense of women of color. And the same white women that were very much involved in codifying colorblind language. So once overt racism became something that was taboo, there was this push from white women to focus on colorblind language. Now, I am talking about there's a lot more of historical events, and I just highlighted a few of how white women were right in the center of white violence towards Black people. But all of these events played major roles in defining white womanhood and the context to which white women are socialized. And if we fast forward to today, nothing's changed. As all of my co-panelists have outlined, white supremacy is intimately involved in the formation of all of our systems: the police, education, healthcare, judicial, the child welfare system. It's indistinguishable from our systems. When something is so ingrained in what we do, it's easier to see overt actions of racism, but much harder to see how we can be causing harm. And so being socialized as a white woman, our history still plays out in how we're received to today, particularly in child welfare and judicial systems. So 85% of social workers being white women nationwide, there have been persistent connection between white women and this role of saviors. As we know, when there's a savior, there is a victim and a villain. So daily social norms are based on whiteness, as some of my other co-panelists have said, including this norm of white women to call those with authority to oversee or strengthen our power. Authority like our bosses or supervisors or the police. And when we talk about evidence-based practice, which is largely based around white people's experience, and that's focused in the child welfare system. So trying to tease out whiteness in child welfare and court is like trying to describe air, right? It's not something that you can pull apart. I know for me, I know I'm running out of time here, but I know for me, I grew up in a liberal working class household. I learned consistent messages of colorblindness and tone policing, all with the intention of not being racist, which was the equivalent of being a bad person. And as a white woman, I developed a very robust savior complex that led me to being a foster parent and being a CPS social worker and now a defense social worker. And knowing that not doing active anti-racist work in every system that I'm involved in means that I'm supporting the status quo and the racist systems. But most importantly, I think about how each of these institutions are problematic and how I have undoubtedly contributed in negative ways. In each of my roles, I was and am a gatekeeper of resources, and that I have a responsibility to that role as a white woman to be an agitator for anti-racist work. I can't use the fact that I am liberal to shield myself from accountability. I can't use the fact that I work as a defense social worker working against this racist system to shield myself from accountability, because I work within it no matter what I do. I have a responsibility being in this position to leverage my whiteness for change. And as a gatekeeper to check in regularly with my biases. I know that if I'm not constantly asking myself questions, that I'm not doing the work. And questions that need to be asking ourselves are our own self-reflection. So how do I use my white womanhood as a weapon against people of color? How have I done that? What anti-racist actions have I avoided? How have I used this idea of allyship to absolve myself of taking stronger actions? These are the questions I should be asking. And I want to be critical of the Amy Coopers of the world, but I also recognize that it's automatic, that it's ingrained. It's not just feelings. The systems were purposely constructed. Even the way in which we react is purposely constructed. So it's not a question of, well, that's not me. It's, if someone calls us racist or Karen, consider sitting with that discomfort instead of reacting in a way that weaponizes whiteness. We as white women have weaponized our whiteness in every system in history. Whether we like it or not, we still have power. And because our systems and how we're viewed and taken in society as victims that need to be protected, any mistakes or blunders in interacting with Black and brown people, they cost lives, it costs family, and it costs freedom. We can't be defensive. We need to do the work every day. We need to prioritize the safety of others over our comfort. I think we need to recognize also that cognitive dissonance is a real thing, and we've been conditioned, we have conditioned responses as white women that stem from how we've been socialized. We need to challenge our responses and be uncomfortable. With that being said, I know, Corey, you've been working on gathering questions for the Q&A, through the Q&A throughout our presentation. What are some of the questions you have for our panel?
Yeah, first, let's just, I'll slow down just a moment. That was a lot, right? So let's just breathe for just a moment, Renee. We're good. And so we can, guess what? We have power over the presentation. But what I have just witnessed and experienced is it requires some acknowledgement that you all took time to enlighten us, and also to hopefully, with all fragility, with all denial and defensiveness that may be coming through some of the chat, and also as people experience the topics, what we set out to do, I feel we did. And that was to name white supremacy and its various dimensions, from interpersonal through structural. And I feel that you guys have done a wonderful job of bringing that to life from your perspectives. The few things that I wanted to touch on that to bring us back before we moved a little bit further, I've also, truly took away from here the myth of Black inferiority is really rampant, right? Regardless of how many years, centuries, we still deal with this in all of our systems. That race as we know it is a construct that we buy into. We constructed it, well, whiteness constructed it. Therefore, since race is a construct, so is white supremacy. That means that it too can be deconstructed. And one of the first times, and as I said, since George Floyd, is an opportunity for institutions to recognize their role in upholding white supremacy. So for all of that and so much more, I just wanted to give some kudos and thank you for being in my village. And I have seen a lot of chat, but there have been a few more hits on the psychiatry mental health piece, but I'm going to really extract one question that I think may fit each of you. And I'm going to start with Beilu. And it wasn't more of a question, it's really more of a comment. And the comment is that biases, well, specifically implicit biases, right? And I have a visceral reaction to that, but that's for level 2. Implicit biases occur at the hotline. I believe they occur in the community. I believe they occur because of anti-Black mindset. I believe they occur because of the myths of racial difference and inferiority. What could we do about that implicit bias that begins at the hotline?
The hotline?
Yeah, well, so when I call
and
say
okay.
that little Black Johnny is climbing the potato chip aisle in the grocery store, something must be wrong with mom.
Yeah. So I think a couple things. I think one, like Renee was saying, I think just taking a minute to sort of like take a step back and understand that your experience isn't universal as a white person, right? Or as a Black or brown person who lives and breathes and operates in a society that has taught us and ingrained in us these very real internalized sort of inferiority complexes, right? So sometimes when we're viewing ourselves or when we're viewing other people who look like us, we have those same ideas that, so-and-so is up to no good, so-and-so is problematic, I don't feel safe, I'm uncomfortable. So really just sitting back and challenging that. I think that one of the things I've heard a long time ago is from a sort of a biological context, we are sort of, we take in information and our biases are there to sort of protect us, right? We take in information and we make decisions about what's safe, who isn't. And in the past it served us because, something with large teeth was coming at us and we knew that we didn't want to engage it, right? But our systems and our societies have changed. We don't have those issues, but we still have that same sort of trigger, right? Someone we don't understand or somebody that doesn't look like us or somebody that doesn't experience life in the way that we do, they're coming at us and we kind of think, oh, big teeth, right? And so I think, again, just kind of sitting back with that, really challenging those concepts, checking in with people in your communities that are really actively doing that work to undo that thinking, to undo those internalized complexes. So just really challenging your internalized sense of inferiority and really challenging your internalized sense of superiority if you are a white person, and really just thinking about comfort and safety and the difference, right? And also thinking about sort of the different expectations we have for Black and brown kids versus white kids, right? Sometimes you'll see white kids running around, doing all the things that would probably get Black and brown kids in a whole lot of trouble, right? We have these different ideas about what's acceptable for Black and brown people versus white people. So just, I would just say, just taking a step back, really challenging yourself to challenge those things, and keeping yourself in community with people who are going to challenge that in you, particularly in child welfare. If you're going to be working in service industries, working really with anybody, communities of color or any marginalized communities, I think it's especially important to not weaponize those things against communities. And it's really, really hard to help, but it's something that we really need to examine more.
Thank you, Belu. I will, take that just one step further before I transition to Milena. Brian Stevenson encourages us to recognize that there isn't any reckoning until we speak plainly, clearly about truth, calling a thing a thing. Those steps are critically important. I think they're wonderful from a high level perspective, and they feel good. However, Belu, in our conversations leading up to this, and my colleagues here, some more tangible things to do is to recognize that we can't will our way into better thinking, right? We can't always live our way into better thinking, that accountability must occur in community, at the hotline. We must begin to understand from a systems perspective, from an institutional perspective, how does child protection uphold and create disparities? That analysis must come as we continue to level up. Once we do that, you ask the question, are Black kids faring at the same rate as white kids? In communities in Florida where I live, unfortunately, Black and brown children they make up a very small percentage of the community population, but are aging out at 80% of white kids, right? So that should tell us something. We work in a system that supports in a cyclical way the racist ideas that we have about Black people. And those ideas come out in our policies. For whatever reason, child welfare, as we know, and as many attorneys are on the call here, there's a level of secrecy in child protection, right? Many other courts, they're open records, family courts, civil courts, criminal courts, it's open. There's so much secrecy here. We get a chance to get away with our biases. And that's why I challenge implicit. Sometimes I think we know exactly how we feel about Black and brown people. And sometimes I think we know exactly what we're doing when we feel that they are broken. When we can begin to shift how we see Black people as if something is wrong with them, looking at segregation from its core, that innately these people were born with malady. It is false superiority is what we're talking about. Challenging that must occur individually and also institutionally. To Milena, and that was a perfect setup because I have a lot of friends that are guardian ad litems and CASAs, right? But many of these individuals come from what Renee talked about, right? White women, Christian, Catholic charities driven, and I'm generalizing here for a moment, but really, really do-gooders, right? We wanna save and rescue children, and oftentimes they have a lot of power in court, and really don't represent the population of children that we're serving in child welfare, right? Right now, we got over 435,000 kids in care, right? 26% of those kids are African-American or identify as Black. That's a lot. You guys could do the math on your own. But the question to Milena is, can you briefly just go through an evolution of the evolutionary timeline of the development of CASA?
Sure. So I actually did see that question, and I will admit that I'm not very well equipped to go through the evolutionary history of CASA, but I think that it is important to talk about, maybe not from the evolutionary portion of it, but to talk about how with the creation of an attorney for the child or a CASA for the child, what we did and how we separated. And I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but how we separated a child from their family. And how I think it really speaks to, we created a narrative that a child can be and can exist outside of where they come from and who they were born with. And that for many children, Black children, poor children, brown children, Native American children, Native children, that those children would be better off. And I think that that's what I wanted to highlight about. I saw the CASA question, and I think it comes down to someone knowing better. And I think to Renee's point of the weaponization, and I think like the true, the weapon being arms pulling, right? CPS pulling children away. I think we really often talk about child welfare very theoretically. And I think as a society, we understand it. Children go into foster care, but what does that really look like? And it looks like children in their home with their family, no longer in that home, and someone coming. And I think, I saw there was some conversation in the chat about what the people look like that come to the home, right? So in New York City, many of I would say the majority of child protective workers, both in the foster care system and in the city system, are women of color. And I think that comes back to the points that we were making earlier about how the system itself is a white supremacist system. And everyone's just the arm of it, right? Everyone's just the workers of that system. And so I think that to bring it back to CASA, I think I think often about when we talk about the position of a child as a separate being, as if we can exist outside of our community and who our family is, and how much value we put in families when we want to, and how we separate those family values and the importance of that connection when it doesn't fit with the white supremacist model, and that family doesn't ascribe to it in the way that we want them to.
Thank you, Milena. So I'll shift a little bit to, to build on that concept of more deserving, right? So we know in our own communities, and I think we touched on this conversation too as we were scaffolding this conversation, in our communities, we measure good and bad, or we measure good by the absence, check it out, the absence of Blackness. So when we think about better schools, better communities, better neighborhoods, better organizations, we think instinctively already about more, the whiter the school, the better the school. If we walked in an all Black board meeting, would that be a little strange to you? Think about it, right? It'd be a little odd, right? And why is that? Because we hold a standard of whiteness, and it's in our pores. It's saturated us, and we are impacted by it in just about everything that we do. And I hope that this gives us an opportunity to really see that. But when it comes to the psychology, MJ, do you have any concrete lit reviews or just your perspective at all about the long-term disproportionate impact of prescribing psychotropic medication for Black and brown kids? The long-term impact on that.
Absolutely. I saw that question as well. That is a great question. I work in multiple counties as also a defense social worker for Parents Council and dependency and neglect cases in Colorado. And I had this case where a part, as we know, treatment part of the treatment plan was for one of the what my client to participate in having a mental health evaluation as well as a substance abuse evaluation. So usually that is standard. And again, our standard, going back to what you said, Corey, our standard is whiteness, right? Psychology is whiteness. So I really want that to sink in. So all of the answers that you're looking towards is rooted in white supremacy. It's rooted in whiteness. That is the standard. So knowing that, that goes to my next point. So he does this, and mind you, that this was a young man of mine, client, biracial. He grew up in the foster care system as well. So I usually see a lot of repeats. Working with Gardner Lightham's office, representing children, then those children do become my adult clients as well. So we know what that cycle looks like. In his treatment plan, from the Department of Human Services, they said, whatever medication recommendations that are in your mental health evaluation, you have to take them. And the attorney at the time that I was working with on there, it just seemed very standard to that attorney that, okay, well, that makes sense because it's very blanket, whatever recommendations come out of there. And it was multiple psychiatric medications that he was prescribed. And he said, I really don't want to take these. And I go, well, then you don't take them. We don't have to. What I didn't realize is that was going to actually have to be an argument in court. That now you have people that are in the system that are being, honestly, children and adults force-fed these medications that, again, so they can uphold that white standard. So if you're not living at that white standard in the psychology lens, therefore, we're going to make you a zombie. A lot of these medications make a lot of my clients zombies, and depends on the medication, depends on the diagnosis. But I find it greatly strange that a lot of my women clientels that have had children, had PTSD, everyone is on the same medication in a substance abuse living environment. Everyone has to have a certain kind of medication. So yeah, I mean, the answer is yes, we are overprescribing. And again, you have to understand, where is the history? How did that narrative start? Because a lot of the time, psychology is not people's field, but everyone in the court system, the caseworkers, the social workers, parents counsel, guardian ad litems, therapists, everyone look towards this theory that is going to be used. Everyone look towards this psychology portion without having an understanding of the basis. What we're doing now in the psychology field, in the cultural psychology, as well as in international psychology, what is very much intertangled, is we're looking at all of these theories, i.e. I have a problem, I like to put that out there, with attachment theory and how is it culturally appropriate to use attachment theory. We use it as we want to. So all of these buzzwords like cultural competency, people don't understand what cultural competency is, because that piece of the empathy in cultural competence, there's no way that you have the cultural competency piece without ever experiencing and understanding what that empathy piece looked like, and dismantling the hierarchy of races. So that's why people can say culturally competent, and I always say, but you're not. So we have this field of psychology, of white psychology, that continues to uphold white supremacy. I want to put this question back to the participants and my colleagues, is we need to start questioning where that basis is. As we go back into the field of psychology and we're looking at it culturally competent, who are those participants in those theories that you are now trying to say that is a blanket over Black and brown families, i.e. the theory of attachment?
Thank you for that, MJ. And a lot of chat here. I'm just checking time. And so, Renee, I did not leave you out, but I'm going to sort of create a question based on some of the chatter I've been seeing. And to be perfectly honest, it stemmed from, and I could have misunderstood this. This is the power of text, right? It stemmed from a proclamation of enough about white women. That's how I receive that, right? So I often talk with systems about their responsibility, our collective responsibility of having this deeper analysis of what racism truly is. That families we are attempting to build an authentic relationship with may not have the definition of what racism is, may not be able to say you're being discriminated, you're being discriminatory, right? But it's our responsibility as professionals. We've taken oaths to this work, so therefore we should understand the pre-existing conditions that families have been born into, that some of their situations they did not create, but they inherited. We have not gotten there yet. So from your perspective, Renee, what must it take for white workers in this field to continue to examine their role specifically in upholding white supremacy?
That's a great question, Corey. I saw that comment as well, and I think that this comes from. I know that we're not. The goal of this panel today is not to derail this idea of focusing on white women. The goal is white women have such a role, and it's so important to acknowledge that role and acknowledge that history plays a role into where we're established in our system today and how we've got to where we are, right? So we're talking level 1, foundational understanding. This history has led us to now and to where we're at in all the problems that we are struggling with in our system. And so in terms of your question, Corey, like white women, the Amy Coopers, the people that we like to dissociate from, the people that we don't want to relate to in many ways, we need to, as white women, start dismantling our weapons of white womanhood. We have this conditioned responses, even when we think we will not. And so the only way around that is to start asking those questions and checking biases in every capacity. Be as involved in the work, asking yourself questions every single day. Check in with yourself about what safety means. So making sure that you're not prioritizing discomfort over safety. And so I mean, practicality, stop calling the police or including the police in safety plans for families of color, actively advocate against this. The effects of racism are also so invasive, and this should be brought up as a primary issue in defense of every parent or child represented in every hearing or meeting attended. And I think lastly on this is that a lot of us have heard of allyship, but it's not this like stagnant identity that we get to claim. We don't get to say, hey, I'm an ally. It's an active role that is practiced consistently. It's holding ourselves accountable and being self-aware. And it's to advance marginalized people's needs, not for our own accolades. And the reason I speak to white women in this is because white women have such a role in child welfare and in these systems, and we have such a responsibility. So that's my answer.
Thank you, Renee. So we're going to transition, and before I do, Claudia, you had a response there or a question as a BIPOC community. What considerations or how do we start the conversation around being implementers of white supremacist culture? I think this the first step is to just structure the conversation, to begin having the conversation, and don't think of it as implementers of a white supremacist system. You are possibly a reproducer of a white supremacist system. The system is already planted. So we're not planters any longer. We have reaped the harvest of white supremacy culture. So with that, we have a level 2 coming up. And, MJ, what might that level 2 look like?
Sure. So in having these conversations, what a lot of people do is they say, okay, now we know, what do I do next? You're not there. I'm gonna let you know this right now. You're not there, you're not ready. This goes back to my domestic violence analogy. So usually domestic violence it's not usually a one-time incident. That relationship is usually years and years, right? So we're still in this domestic violence relationship, and domestic violence, Black Americans as the survivors, or Black and brown people as the survivors, and white America is the perpetrator and or abuser. You don't get to say, all right, I've heard enough about all the things I've done to you. I've acknowledged that I've hit you in your eye that one time, but okay, I'm ready to come back into the home. Where we're at right now is that you have to sit with what you've done. White America has to sit with what they've done and truly acknowledge their role and their part in how they have continued this domestic violence abusive cycle to Black and brown Americans. So that's the reason why I always tell people that you need to wait. I have an entire organization where I work with directors of organizations because they say, okay, how do I be an ally? And you have to first examine yourself first, because just like Renee said, being an ally is the action step. If you have not fully acknowledged everything you have done as white America, then we're not ready. You can't move back into the house. We're not ready. We have not done enough healing. I need to heal. You also need to figure out what you've done and why you need to heal so you can be a better person. And that brings us to what level 2 is. So level 2 is more of that action piece and that action step. I know that I continuously make that joke about Black people have about until around Halloween, October 31st for Black lives to still matter in America, because we have this attention span when we forget all of the bad things that we've done, again, like domestic violence relationships. But what's going to be different this time, and this is the hope that I have, is what's going to be different this time is that now you know. And when you know better, then you will be held accountable to do better. And there will not be a lot of wiggle room for excuses. So we as the survivors now know what that cycle looks like. And now that we've went through some therapy and we've gotten some training, now we're able to say, it looks like this is gonna go back down to the same place. So therefore, we're gonna hold you accountable when we see any kind of slip. So before you can put those action steps into place, you have to sit with exactly what those behaviors are. What was the manipulation? What was the gaslighting? And what is your role in that? And then we can move towards level 2, which means that hopefully you can enter the home and you can be in a better position and in a better place, and you can actually start to cohesively live in this community together. So that is the short version of wrapping up, but ultimately you're not.
I love it. I love it.
My short version.
So lots to come, basically, and let's not jump to needing a 5-point plan just yet, good people. You've been drinking this Kool-Aid for 401 years. A solution will not come without understanding the history, and that history has to do more with the present than the past. Mimi may have some closing words for us. Mimi, let it ride.
Thank you, Corey, and thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to all of our participants as well. We exceeded our 500 cap. I've been getting emails from people that couldn't get in, so a recording will be shared. And please, everyone that participated, share that widely. From the chat, as Corey said, we see that there was a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of interest, and a lot of good thinking that our participants have been doing. So on behalf of the ABA Center on Children in the Law and the National Alliance for Parent Representation, I really do thank all 5 of you. And I'm very much looking forward to September 16th and hope all of our participants will join us again. So thank you all and have a good afternoon. Take a deep breath.
So proud of all.
I'm step away real quick. We're gonna do a little debrief in a minute.
Yeah, can you guys all use your panel line and get back in? Because I think that this part is still being recorded. So everybody call back in.